Alright, in this video we are going to start looking at the anatomy of the female reproductive system. This section will also cover the development of the eggs and the ovaries, which will be a separate video because that's a slightly more involved process than spermatogenesis. And then we'll also look at some hormone changes during the monthly cycle that this reproductive system goes through each month. So here's a quick overview of the reproductive anatomy in females. So a lot of this does get covered in lab material this week. So the external structures are collectively referred to as the vulva. So this includes all of these external structures, which are the mons pubis, labia majora, labia minora, clitoris, hymen. So that's all in the vulva, and then breast is also part of those external structures. Internally are the ovaries, and then oviducts or uterine tubes or fallopian tubes, the uterus itself, cervix, and actual vagina. So here's a couple kind of quick images from the textbook showing a lateral or sagittal cross section, and then here's more of a transverse cut, so looking at it from an anterior view. So I know these are really small, but you can kind of zoom in on these in the slides yourself or look at the textbook, as well as the images and models for this week's lab material. So this is the uterus right here. This would be the cervix down here at the bottom, ovaries out here, the actual vagina, and then some of these more external structures out here in the vulva. And then again, anterior view here, just a slightly different way of looking at things. So again, the vulva is this external genitalia area. So a lot of people refer to that area as the vagina, and that's not accurate. That is kind of commonplace in normal language, but it is scientifically and anatomically inaccurate because that is more accurately the vulva. So the mons pubis is a fat pad that is going to sit over the front part of the hip bones, so the pelvic bones in front of that pubic symphysis. This is going to be covered with pubic hair after puberty starts. The labia majora are typically seen as the larger lips. Labia minora is seen as the smaller ones that will kind of enclose the clitoris. But that's not always true, that the labia majora are larger and the labia minora are smaller. I prefer to see it as the labia majora are going to be usually a bit more fatty tissue in them for cushioning. There's going to be a lot more actual skin tissue there rather than mucous membranes. And then the labia minora are going to be thinner. So there's not a lot of fatty tissue in there, and they're more mucous membrane tissue than actual skin. But they do sometimes they're sometimes larger than the labia majora are. So there's a lot of variation naturally within the population. There is a glans clitoris. This is the most sensitive area, but most of the actual clitoris itself sits internally, so it's not visible. And then the hymen is a thin membrane that will partially or mostly cover the vaginal canal. We're going to talk more about that in a little bit because there's a lot of misconceptions around that. And then there is Bartholin's gland, or the greater vestibular gland, which does produce some of the secretions and fluid for lubrication. So this is going to be that vulva. So the labia majora are going to be further out, closer to the legs. The labia minora are much thinner, again, more mucous membrane tissue. And then the clitoris sits where those meet. And then we've got the external urethral opening that would be sitting down here, or in this image it's further down here. Everybody's anatomy is a little bit different. And then the actual vaginal opening are both kind of encased or bordered by the labia minora. And then we also have, again, slightly inside of that vaginal opening is going to be some of those glands. So this over here is the actual structure of the clitoris itself. And so this glans is really the main visible part of this particular structure. Everything else is deeper, and so it's not going to be visible. But it is wildly different structure than what is shown on the models that we have available for this unit and in the classroom and stuff like that, which honestly irritates me excessively. But some of them are older, so I can forgive that a little bit. But the newer ones, I would like to start seeing some of the newer models showing a more accurate representation of this structure, because anatomy should be accurate. So this is the actual clitoris. So this would be the vaginal opening. The glands kind of sit on either side of the opening. The urethral opening also encased here. All right, moving on to the vagina itself, also sometimes referred to as the vaginal canal. So this is muscle. It's a lot of muscle, and kind of marks the entrance or exit to the rest of the reproductive tract. So this is exiting from the uterus for menses and childbirth. And there is going to be that mucous membrane again that has what are called transverse rugae, so a lot of folds. There is a middle smooth muscle layer, and then there is some fibrous adventitia more on the outside. It does naturally have a lot of bacteria as well as some fungus, so this is considered normal flora, and as long as everything is maintained properly, nothing kind of overgrows, then there are no issues, and this kind of helps maintain the vaginal canal as a very acidic environment, which helps reduce the chances of various infections and stuff like that. But again, that can get thrown off, and that's usually what is going to lead to either yeast infections or bacterial vaginosis, which is when either the bacteria or the yeast that naturally live there overgrow due to sometimes antibiotic treatment, sometimes the introduction of new hygiene products and stuff like that. There's a lot of things that can kind of throw that off. The ovaries are roughly almond-sized gonads. These are going to be in the pelvis, so this is the equivalent to the testes. So they are producing the gametes. These are held in place by some different ligaments. We're only covering one of these, or two of these, in lab. So we have the meso-ovarium, which is going to just be some connective tissue anchoring them in place. We have the broad ligament, which is going to help cover both the ovaries and the uterus. We have suspensory ligaments, and then the ovarian ligament itself, which anchors them to the uterus itself. So here's the uterus, this pear-shaped organ. The broad ligament, again, this is kind of a big sheet of ligament that will cover the uterus and help anchor the ovaries in place, as well as some of these other structures. This is the ovarian ligament, so really kind of keeping it connected and close to the uterus, so that it's positioned correctly with the uterine tubes right here, so that the egg can actually enter the uterine tubes correctly. So the ovary is covered with simple cuboidal epithelial tissue, and then it has the tunica albuginea, which is very white, dense connective tissue. Then it has a cortex, which is where the follicles develop, and then the medulla, which is going to contain blood and lymphatic vessels, as well as nerves. So we'll talk more about the ovarian cycle in another video, but this is what happens in the ovaries itself. This is on average 28 days, but can range from anywhere between 21 and 32, depending on each individual person. Much outside of this can indicate a disorder like PCOS or something like that, among other issues. And this is going to have two simultaneous processes happening. First is what's called oogenesis, so the gametes here are oocytes, or eggs, to get those female gametes to develop. And then the other process is folliculogenesis, which develops the ovarian follicles, which are support structures for the egg cells. So this oogenesis starts with oogonia, or germ cells or stem cells, dividing to primary oocytes before birth. So this process starts during fetal development. Between birth and puberty, these kind of sit at that stage, is this primary oocyte. So we stop that cell division process after meiosis 1. And then when puberty starts, then there's going to be a hormone increase, which will signal this process to continue from that meiosis 1. And generally speaking, there's going to be one egg ovulated per ovarian cycle. Sometimes there are multiple eggs ovulated. That is how fraternal twins and triplets and stuff like that come into existence. But that's not super common. It's not rare by any means, but it does usually happen with just one egg. And that ovulation has to be with one actual egg, so that primary oocyte will divide what's called unevenly into two structures. So instead of getting two identical daughter cells, we end up with a secondary oocyte that gets most of the cytoplasm. This is what develops into the egg that will be ovulated. And then the other structure is a small cell, which is called the first polar body. This can divide or break down. Next up, requires the presence of sperm for the next stage of oogenesis. So if sperm are present and actually penetrate that ovum, then that secondary oocyte will divide, again unevenly, to get a second small polar body and a fully mature ovum. This finishes out the meiosis 2 process, and the mature ovum is going to have most of the cytoplasm and half of the chromosomes again. So the sperm has 23 chromosomes, the egg has the other 23, and that is ready for the actual fertilization step and combining of the sperm and egg cells and their chromosomes. If there are no sperm present, or they are not able to penetrate through the outer layers after about 24 hours, that ovum will break down and get discarded during the menses. So here's our graphic kind of showing what that looks like. So we have our stem cell up here with 2 ends, so 46 chromosomes. It will go through mitosis again and begin right here with meiosis. So meiosis 1 starts here with the primary oocytes. All right, so we still have 46 chromosomes here. And this line right here represents birth. So before birth, we're pausing right there. So we still have that full 46 chromosomes here, and we are not going to continue dividing until after puberty starts. So those hormone levels increase, and then meiosis 1 will continue and pick up there and divide into our secondary oocyte and first polar body. And now we just have 1 N, so 23 chromosomes, because that's the process of meiosis, is splitting that number of chromosomes in half so that those daughters are going to have half the number of chromosomes. And so that secondary oocyte can further go through meiosis 2 and develop into that mature ovum in the presence of sperm. And then the polar body will divide into secondary polar bodies, and then we can also get that secondary polar body from that oocyte splitting into the mature ovum and that polar body. All right. We are going to continue talking about folliculogenesis in the next video, since this is a little bit different, so I don't want these to get mixed up.